Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Southeast Alaska Discovery Center. The Forest Service is celebrating 30 years of this building being in place and 28 years of this program in 2025, which is awesome. We do want to welcome everyone, and without further ado, I'm going to get off this mic and introduce you to Emily Moore, who's our primary speaker, and Richard Jackson, and they are going to get you started this evening. So thank you.
I'll have to ask the Taant'a Kwáan Yanwakishihit Shadahani to speak first because you're on his land.
Kichxáan. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Joel Buchanan. I'm Taant'a Kwáan Ganahati Yanwalashihit. I'm from the Raven Moati Drifted Ashore House of the Tongass people. My mother's name is Ta'ats. Her mother's name was Kichxáan. Her mother's name was Ta'ats. Her mother's name was Kintlay. So that takes us back to about the era of the Civil War. That's as much as I know of the family line. My Chna was from Heidelberg, from the Eagle Crest, and my Yaya was from the Killabo people, from the Tsimshian people on Annette Island. So if you were from those people groups, Kichxáan, Hawa, and Deutschen. My father's Scottish and German, and if I knew Gaelic, I would tell you thank you for being here in German, but I do not. But I would like to acknowledge my father's people as well, just to be respectful. Part of the presentation tonight, you'll hear about Frank and Emma Williams. I would like you to know that Uncle Frank was my grandmother's brother, and Frank and Emma were the last of the arranged marriages between the Taakwaani and the Raven of the Tongass people. And you'll also hear about Taakwaani, which is now Metlakatla as we know it. But Kichxáan, or George C. William, as his IRS name was given to him, he was married to Kintlay. His name was Kichxáan. He shook hands with Robert Reuben Ridley on the beach when they came for the exploratory trip to find a new place for religious freedom from old Metlakatla in Canada. So that's just part of the background of the story you're going to hear tonight as Emily gives her presentation. And I'm deeply honored that Emily is doing this for us to speak, to acknowledge us, to acknowledge the Southern Tlingits. And I'd like to acknowledge all of her hard work. She's been a trusted friend and very loyal about always being as truthful as she can be about her presentations and what she provides to not only information she learns back to us, but to others as well, what she's doing to you tonight. Kichxáan for hearing my words.
Before I introduce myself, I got the proper introduction from my mother, which I have forgotten, so I'll read it. But I'd like to acknowledge that because Kwáan is here, and I'm here supporting them for their hearing role, our hearing role. I'm glad that they are attending tonight, and I see Kai over here, and he's from Kichxáan. He's a great grandson of Taakwaani. It's important to do that because they're here on a very important mission with preservation of cultural food, which is not only for Tlingits, it's for the Haidas and Tsimshian. So this is the proper way my mother would have said introduction. You say, Akat Tlingit Hus, my parental uncles, Akat Hus, my parental aunts, Akani Hus, my maternal uncles, Akla Hus, my maternal aunts, Aklis Kuhus, my grandparents, Akat Ik, nobility, Shandi Nek, leaders, Yaki, my children, Akdakshun, my grandchildren. Then she would say, Gunashish, Hachat, Ye Adi Kuni, Ye Aya Aktu Situ. Thank you for coming, my friends. This is how I feel. And then I'd go further and say, Kushakak Yuhatwasak. That is my name. Kushakak is my uncle's name, Bill Andrews. I inherited from him. It's a symbolic immortality of living the name and continuing the name. And I'm Chak Nakatsati. I'm from the Eagle Moati, and I'm Taant'a Kwáan Taakwaani. And the Taant'a Kwáan, which means the sea lion people, the Taakwaani, and I'm from the Ketchikan, which is a house called the Man Who Married the Brown Bear House. And Kagwan Tan Yeti Katsati, my child of the Kagwan Tan. Father was Chilkat from Tlingit, from the Gauhit, and they reside now, my family, in Gu. It's used to be my first cousin Bessie Fred, her husband was Matthew Fred. He's Taan, and he's, of course, Taan. And Ketchikan, which is the name of this town, Ketchikan. So that would be the way you would cover everybody that's here without insulting somebody that's related to you. I covered my maternal side and my paternal side and where I am from and who my father is. So we're here tonight to go through the discussion of some of the history of the Taant'a Kwáan. There's many interpretations that come together. But the picture you see there was the first picture of anybody that was Alaska Native. It was done by Edward Mybridge, who I was in a movie with the production of this called Exposing Mybridge. That was done a couple of years ago. And I guess that won an award for the Reader's Award of some sort. And that picture, I had that given to me by the producer, and I told him in this interview, I said, I'm looking at my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. My grandmother, her name is Alice Harris, and her name was Kichxáan. And my great-grandfather's Shaw Clyn, which is a subdivision here in Ketchikan. We're way up on a hill that's called Shaw Clyn. He was in charge of giving the land allotments out here in Ketchikan to when they first gave land allotments in this area, more down by Johnson Pole and further down and up by Woodland Avenue. And that was given to the Tongass and then to those that were here in the Tsimshians at the time. We lived close to the Yanabusi Shihit, 15 the Shore House. And you see the Johnson Pole here. They call it the Johnson Pole. That's actually the Kichxáan Pole. That's the Golden Eagle. We have been close ties, both of us, through Emma Williams, so my relative, and as was stated, she had an arranged marriage, and I know the story. She went to Chimawa with her sister Maud, and they called her back, and she had to get married to Frank Williams, and she wanted to go to school, but she came back and married him. And I think she was only 14 years old. And in those days, you kept your hierarchy and your family status by doing this. When she passed away, I was working at the Pioneer Home as a journeyman mechanic, and she was 99, and it's going on 100. And she would tell me when we're talking, stay out of a wheelchair. She always walked with a wheelchair. 99 years old, she did. Very, very active lady. So we're here tonight to review this history too. Tongass people were very migration people, and so I'm sure that you'll hear this in this journey that's going to happen here tonight. I'm happy that Emily has invited us here to be involved, and this is the first time I'm seeing this presentation. So I'll be enjoying reviewing our family history. We have traveled to Taant'a Island. She'll mention Village Island. I want to mention that a lot of the involvement in Ketchikan through my mother was done on journeys with Priscilla Schulte, who is here today. She's an anthropologist who retired from the college, and I just wanted to acknowledge her wherever she's sitting, because my mother really enjoyed going on these journeys to Taant'a Island and other places, and identifying the areas that we fished and hunted, and the spiritual areas that we were, such as Duke Island. We originally come from the Unique River area, along with the Taant'a Kwáan Taakwaani, the Tlingit, which is my dreams, means dreams. We came here, of course, in 1893 and settled here by the Yanabusi Shihit, who were here already. We came with the Taant'a Kwáan, and they settled in Saxman, and at that time there was no road. And the boat road was built later, so when my grandmother wanted to come to town, she would row to town, and they always stood up in the rowboat and rowed. But we had a large family, and my family, when my mother married my father, we had 14 kids, and there was eight brothers and 6 sisters. Now there's just 5 brothers left. So I'll turn it over and thank Emily for this nice presentation. She's worked hard on it, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
I appreciate it so much. Emily Moore Yuchat Daasaxakw, Kichxáan Hood City, Nisga'a, Colorado, Yuchat Yati, Norway Kwáan Dutchhan, Atutchat Jiaduatan, Achawe Kichxáan Ayachat, Kudanik Yuchat Daasaxakw. Please forgive me for my mistakes. I'm still learning, but I wanted to use my introduction from elementary Tlingit to introduce myself as Emily Moore, grandchild of Norwegian and German and Scottish people here in Ketchikan, where I grew up on Ketchikan Creek. I now live and work as a professor of art history at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. So I'm grateful to Kelly White and Cape Fox Cultural Foundation for inviting me back to Ketchikan today. And I'm especially grateful to Richard Jackson and Joel Buchanan. Richard is Shade Hani of the Taant'a Kwáan of the Taant'a Kwáan Taakwaani, and Joel is Shade Hani of the Taant'a Kwáan Ganachadi. It means a great deal to me that they have given me permission to present some of this research here on Taant'a Kwáan land. And so I'm really grateful for their permission. I also want to be clear that this research is my own, and so I take responsibility for any mistakes. I don't want them to be implicated because I'm learning this history. So thank you for your patience with me. I'm focusing on the Taant'a Kwáan because of my interest in Southern Tlingit histories that have not been well represented in my field of Northwest Coast Native art history. And just to be clear tonight, I'll be using this term Kwáan frequently, and I wanted to be sure everyone knows this Tlingit term for a regional group of clans. So if we look at this famous traditional Tlingit country map, you can see the different Kwáans mapped out, like Kichxáan Kwáan, people of the outside of Baranof Island, right? So their winter village would be at Sitka. They had family, clan-owned streams and hunting grounds where they could spread out in the spring and summer and fall, and then in the winter would return back to their primary winter village at Sitka. Kichxáan Kwáan, the people of the Kichxáan or Stikine region, again centered in originally Kazitlan and then Wrangell. So these are all these regional groups of Tlingit people, and I'm very interested in these southernmost Kwáans, partly having grown up in Ketchikan, and partly again because they're not as represented in the literature. So the Taant'a Kwáan I'll be talking about today, this map is a little confusing because you can see that they have Moira Sound over on the east coast of Prince of Wales still mapped out. Revillagigedo, parts of Revillagigedo, and then it snakes around down to Tongass Island and some of that area up in Pierce Canal. So, but Taan, as Richard and Joel already said, it means sea lion in Tlingit, and their homeland was from the southern area of Prince of Wales, where there are many sea lion rookeries, and as I understand, an important feature of Kichxáan that resembles a sea lion nose. So their name comes from that southern area where they once lived, the Taant'a Kwáan. You can see in the map here too, all of the two different moieties, or the two moieties, the ravens represented by the Ganachadi, and wolf, later known as eagle moiety, the Taakwaani, and the Daasaxakw, and all the different houses under each of these clans. My understanding is that the Daasaxakw are no longer represented here, So now we have the Ganachadi and the Taakwaani as the two primary clans of the Taant'a Kwáan. The reason that I'm so interested in the Taant'a Kwáan, Sanya Kwáan, by the way, I'd love to work more with Sanya Kwáan leaders, if you'll have me. But I'm really interested because in my field of Northwest Coast art history, there's been much more attention paid to Kwáans up north. So the famous book by Aldona Joanides, Art of the Northern Tlingit, right? It has the beautiful picture of Ye Hit, the whale house of the Ganachadi clan up in Kichxáan, on the massive tomes of Frederica de Laguna on Yakutat. And I want to say right away, this study is very important and those Kwáans are very important. But I'd also like to see more attention on the Southern Kwáans. I think there's been a historical bias in anthropology and art history, at least, against so-called acculturated Kwáans, people who had more contact with Euro-Americans or other groups. And I've included this quote from Oral Kraus, one of the earliest anthropologists, or he was actually kind of an amateur ethnologist from Germany who was sent over to do collecting. And you can see he was so excited to gain passage up to Chilkat because he considered this the least acculturated of Tlingit people. So I think there's been a bias in my own discipline against some of the Southern Kwáans, and maybe this is why it's not as represented. But you all know, living in this area right around Dixon Entrance, I mean, look at all of the nations. It's a really rich place down here with Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, Nisga'a, Tsetsaut, as I've learned. I'm only still learning about some of these Athabascan peoples who are up in Portland Canal. So it's a really rich history. And of course, down here in the southern Tlingit is also, it's such an interesting place for art because up in northern Tlingit, Ani, as you may know, up in Kichxáan, they really favored interior house posts, gats, instead of exterior kutia, the massive monumental exterior totem poles, as we call them in English. And so it's really down here in the southern region, like at Kadukuka, at Tongass Village, place of the cottonwoods, that we have more of those exterior monumental poles. It's in this area right around Dixon Entrance where we have so much of the massive monumental kind of forested villages, as people wrote of this area. I also wanted to share this quote from George Emmons, a U.S. Navy lieutenant, whom I'm sure many of you know had done a lot of important collecting in Tlingit Ani. And he wrote that the shores of Dixon Entrance and the nearby coast, the home of the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, is the center of Native intelligence and art is an acknowledged fact. And I think, in fairness, this was probably his way of talking about this Dixon Entrance region, as he really did love northern Northwest Coast art from the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. But I like it to kind of focus really on the southern Tlingit area and Kaigani, Haida, Tsimshian, this really rich interchange around Dixon Entrance that I think deserves a lot more study. So we won't tell Juno about that, my interpretation of that quote. No, I'm joking. I think he really admired the art all over this area. So to start, I wanted to have a kind of thesis statement to talk about some of this history of Taant'a Kwáan people by citing Joseph Johns, who's Taant'a Kwáan Taakwaani. And in 1946, he, along with many other Taant'a Kwáan and Sanya Kwáan and many other people, gave testimony to Goldschmidt and Haas, who are lawyers sent from Washington, D.C. to document indigenous land claims in Southeast Alaska. And this was a really important quote that I'll use as a kind of guide and outline for tonight's talk. So speaking of the Taakwaani, he wrote, "Our people started on the Unuk River and moved outside of Prince of Wales Island to Doll Island. from there to Tlingit on Prince of Wales Island in Heidelberg Territory, then down to Ketchikan, then to Annette Island at a place between Deer and Tent Points. From there, the Tongass people moved to a place on the outside of Duke Island, then to Village Island and Cat Island, just to the north of Duke Island. There are still totem poles and graves at this place, and my own parents lived there. Some of the people came directly to Ketchikan from there, and others first went over to Tongass Village. This was before the American soldiers came up there. I was born in Tongass Village, and soon afterwards, we moved up here to Ketchikan. So it's a nice outline of some of the main village sites that I'd like to talk about tonight. And because it's important to balance a Taakwaani statement with an opposite from the Ganachadi, I've also included this statement from Peter Williams, who was Ganachadi, and he made this statement to anthropologist T.T. Waterman in 1922. Some of you might know that Waterman came up and was studying a lot of place names, a lot of the indigenous place names, and worked with Peter Williams in particular. I'm not going to read this entire statement, but just to highlight, he also talks about the west coast, the southern west coast of Prince of Wales for the Ganachadi. Then they go to Ketchikan, the south end of Prince of Wales, over to Annette and Duke Island, and talking about Taakwaani, at where Metlakatla is now, before going to Tongass, and then later Ketchikan and Saxman. So again, these are the main village sites that I'd really like to focus on tonight. And what I also want to do as an art historian is to focus on the village sites where we still have crest arts that are extant, because that's what I'm really trying to study to understand some of this history. So we'll start on Annette Island, Taakwaani, winter town at Port Chester. And by the way, many of you who are learners of Tlingit Yuchatangi, you may recognize that root word for winter, which in standard Tlingit would be written with a up accent on the A, but I'm using the Tongass dialect orthography because it was a slightly different dialect down here in the southern region, another very distinctive characteristic of the southern Tlingit. I'll talk more about in a second. So after migrating from Taan, from Prince of Wales, and you can see Moira Sound up on that map, Annette Island was a really important site for the Taant'a Kwáan Tlingit. And there are many testimonies from Taant'a Kwáan people and Taant'a Kwáan who talk about that, some of the village sites that were on Annette Island. I have Joseph Johns here on the left, and then Annie Haldane, who also testified for Goldschmidt and Haas in 1946. And she said, the Tongass people came from the southern tip of Prince of Wales Island. The Taakwaani claimed in olden days Annette Island. I never went there, except once when we hunted around the island. This was before Annette Island was made into a reservation. It was a fine place, and the present site of Metlakatla was formerly a winter camp used by the Taakwaani clan before the Tsimshian people came there. So Taakwaani, where you've probably heard the term Taakwaan, right? The Smalgak or Tsimshian version of Taakwaani was on that Port Chester side. And then on the map, I was trying to find an image of Tamgas Harbor. There was also a village there that Joseph Johns had referenced when he was talking about a village between Deer and Tent Points on the Tamgas Harbor side. And that's Kichxáan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Thimbleberry town. Important Taakwaani villages where their Ganachadi opposites lived with them. I apologize for this grainy image. I'm trying to find a better image of Frank and Emma Williams, who I'm sure many of you knew. This was a photocopy out of Tongass texts, a really important linguistic study by Jeff Lear in the 1970s. Jeff Lear was studying the Tongass dialect, as I'd mentioned, and Frank and Emma were known as some of the last speakers of that particular dialect. So the recordings of them speaking are really important in the history of linguistics. One of the stories, though, that Frank Williams told regarded Taakwaani, and this is what he said. He said, Taakwaani, winter town. That's an Indian name. Tlingit go there wintertime. Tongass, and I'm not sure if it should have been transcribed as Tamgas, is on the other side of Annette Island. Salmon, sockeye salmon on the other side. And they moved there, Taakwaani, for a sandy beach so they could put up a canoe, a fine sandy beach. So they moved there in the wintertime. So they called it Taakwaani, winter town. I'm sure those of you who've been over to Metlakatla know about that fine sandy beach that Frank Williams was referencing. You can see it in this photograph. Really great place for canoes in the wintertime. And this is another quote from William Paul, the famous lawyer of Alaska Native Brotherhood fame, who really fought for Indigenous rights and Indigenous land claims in the 20th century. His father was Taant'a Kwáan. And he wrote, what is now New Metlakatla was formerly a Taakwaani town founded by Kichxáan, my mother's uncle. White men had named it Port Chester before it became New Metlakatla. Figuring 35 years to a generation, it would be 5 generations ago, or about 1800, when Taakwaani was established. Young people at that time liked Taakwaani, where a sawmill now stands. It had a fine beach, good water, and safe harbor. It wasn't long before they began to stay longer. As the older generation grew older, they too stayed until the time came when Taakwaani became their principal town. I've been looking through logbooks from the fur trade, trying to find references to Taakwaani, Kichxáan, any of these Tongass villages, Taant'a Kwáan villages. And I'm really interested in this particular logbook. It's at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. It's from 1824. And I don't know if you can see in this handwriting, but they spend several days at Kichxáan, as they write there. 1 day at Kichxáan, 2 days at Kichxáan. You can say 2, and he continues to go on. The writing and the references are very confusing to me, and so if anyone knows these references, please let me know. But the logbook starts on the 13th of April in 1824 at Cape Mumaws. I'm not sure if that's Munoz, because then he says, and we're going up Clarence Straits, but westward for Point Rose in Haida. So I really can't quite figure out what he's talking about. These may have been earlier terms or earlier sites. But what happens is there's terrible weather. It's impossible to clear through Clarence Straits, and so they end up in front of this village that he calls Kichxáan. And I'm not sure if that was Saquon over Prince of Wales, but the reference to Clarence Straits all the time really has me wondering if this could be Kichxáan, but I don't know why you wouldn't have the E sound on. Anyway, I just wanted to share some of the research, even if they may be dead ends. I'm really trying to find some references to these early village sites in fur trade logbooks. Sometime in the 1850s, and I also just wanted to share a Tsimshian side of this story because, of course, in 1887, the Tsimshian come to Annette Island with Father Duncan. And this story was shared with me by Dr. Michael Askren D'Angeli now. She's married. She's now a professor at the University of Victoria, but grew up in Metlakatla and has always acknowledged that Taant'a Kwáan Tlingit history in her own community. So this was an oral narrative shared originally by William Leask, whom I understand was one of the youngest of the scouts who had originally come over from Old Metlakatla, BC, to try to find an appropriate site for Tsimshian people to land in Alaska. And I'll just start in the middle. It says, William Lease told us they met a canoe right outside of where the graveyard is now, out in Metlakatla. They didn't know who this man was. In those days, they communicate by using Chinook language, just like we do with English today. And they met this man right out by where the graveyard is now. They told him what they were doing. They were looking for land where they were going to settle and move over. And this man told them, don't go any further. This is the best place. So that was the man that recommended this island. I never did know his name. He was known to us as Chief Johnson. He lived in Ketchikan, and he died not too many years ago. So in this story, again, William Leask's memory was of Chief Johnson meeting them outside of Taakwaani and telling the Tsimshian that this was the best site for them. Later on in the excerpt, you can see they mistake Taant'a Kwáan as a summer camp. It means winter village. But this at least is one of those histories shared amongst the Tsimshian. When the Tsimshian arrived in 1887, there were still poles from the Taant'a Kwáan Tlingit that had escaped the fire in the 1830s, 1840s, whenever that attack was. You can see this caption says, log cabins and other housing constructed by Metlakatlans for shelter during the first winter, totem pole erected by former Indian occupants. So acknowledging this kind of earlier history of a different indigenous group that had been there. And you can see the remaining pole there, already fairly old, growing maybe some spruce seedlings out the top. What's really amazing is that those poles that were at Taakwaani, Father Duncan was going to burn them. He didn't want any indigenous practices in his this Christian village of Metlakatla. But Sheldon Jackson up in Sitka, another missionary, of course, who is establishing the Sheldon Jackson Museum and the school, asked Father Duncan to save those poles so that he could bring them up to Sitka, and they're still there. So these two poles were now secured for the museum. And this is an old photo of where the poles were when they first went up to the Sheldon Jackson Museum. If you've been to the Sheldon Jackson Museum, it's been rearranged, and you can still see those original poles from Taakwaani. There are two in the very center. This one that I'm showing you at the very center is one of the poles, and then the other one is on its backside. So the photograph on the left are the two poles as they were at Metlakatla in 1888, being prepared to be shipped up to Sitka. And the art historian Steve Brown has made a really compelling argument that this pole on the right may have been carved by Kichxáan, the legendary kind of late 18th century, early 19th century Kichxáan carver from Wrangell. He was so well known across Southeast Alaska. We know that he was brought up to Tlingit to carve for Yehit, the whale house up there. And he may have been brought down here in the Tongass area as well. If you compare the Taakwaani pole that's up in Sitka to a known pole by Kichxáan up in Wrangell, you can see the very broad features of both human men figures, the very wide lips, the wide treatment of the eyes. There's a lot of comparison on the kind of rounded features of these carvings. So it's really interesting to consider the possibility that this Taant'a Kwáan carver may have also been down here. I don't know for certain about that. I'm also trying to understand the crests that are depicted on those Taakwaani poles. It seems to be a human figure, and I can't tell if he has a bib or if this is a frog down on his chest. in which case that would probably be Ravenside Ganachadi. But again, I'm not sure. Just there's really so little information about these poles. The other pole, the second pole from Taakwaani, is this more spare pole of a human figure holding a fish, and it may be a sculpin. For a long time, this was talked about as a strongman figure, but that didn't make a lot of sense because strongman is usually depicted tearing apart a sea lion. And I found this note by William Paul in the Sheldon Jackson Museum files that he had tucked in there many years ago. And he identified this pole by saying, the man is Fire Drill's son, Tushiyadi. His wife was daughter of the Calm, Kuyedisi, and they had a son named Hlikijene. And again, I'm sorry, I don't know how to read his orthography. Whose dog made from a burnt root was burnt. Tlakachine has 12 children, 7 of whom he would pet and feed and finally hug against his breast while wearing his codfish spine shirt. And at least 7 were killed in that manner. We're going to see this image again and again in some of the Taant'a Kwáan poles of a man holding what's often been described as a sculpin or some kind of fish with spines on the back. And so maybe that is what's being depicted here. I just don't know. I'm trying to learn more about the crests from this early village. When I sent this spelling up to Hone, Lance Twitchell at the University of Alaska Southeast, he thought that the orthography William Paul was using may, in contemporary orthography, be written as Lakachene. And he shared a Kichxáan story with a similar history of this man who wears a tunic that's sharp and would he'd wear this tunic. So again, a lot of tonight is me presenting just kind of what my questions are and trying to really understand some of this early Taant'a Kwáan, some of these crests from the early villages. The only other cultural objects from Taakwaani that I know of that are extant are in the Eugene and Claire Thaw collection at the Fenimore Cooper Museum or the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York. And these are 2 beautiful raven houseposts, gots. They have a very strange history. I tried to copy this for you. You can see they were held at the Ballard Elks Club for decades until they were sold to an art dealer. But the history was always very clear. They said they came from Port Chester on Annette Island, Taant'a Kwáan. And if you look closer, again, they're gorgeous. When I first saw these, I wondered if it was a depiction of ravens stealing the sun, the famous story from the Yelkutlaq. But others have since suggested to me that it may be raven diving for kelp, this downward kind of dive that he's really doing. If you look very closely at the 2 house posts, they're similar, but there are slight differences in the width of the face on the left, for example, versus on the right. And just the surface design work is gorgeous. So probably a raven moiety house, right? But again, I just don't know which house it was from. But there are only 4 carvings extant from Taakwaani that I know of in the world. And so these are really special ones. After Taakwaani, the Taant'a Kwáan moved to Daasaxakw, sand all around, or village island. And this is a teeny island. It's so hard to even find on maps. Some of you may know between Duke Island and it's right off of Cat Island. It's this tiny little village. I think I've heard it said a 1/5 of a mile long. And it was named by Commander Nichols Passage fame, who came upon it in the I have that note somewhere. Sometime in the mid-19th century, and he noted that there were 15 houses on this tiny island, and so that's why he named it Village Island, really important village of the Taant'a Kwáan. One of the best aerial photographs that I've seen of it is by Hall Anderson from the Ketchikan Daily News years ago, but here you can really see that sand all around, right? Daasaxakw. And it's amazing to think there were 9 houses right on Daasaxakw, and then right across from it at low tide, you can walk over, maybe in a little bit of water, to Cat Island, and apparently there were 4 other houses there as well. So there are so many kutia, and we're fortunate that some of them were preserved in the 1969 totem pole survey that the Alaska State Museum did. And we have 8 of the poles from Village Island or Daasaxakw now at the Totem Heritage Center right here in Ketchikan. So I don't have time to go into all of them. Oh, I did want to share this quote from Emma Williams, again in some of her recordings for Tongass Texts. She was remembering stories that her mother-in-law, her husband's mother, had told her about Daasaxakw. And in particular, the famous thing about the very deep excavations in the houses down into the fire pits. So here she says, now this one on Cat Island, the Tlingit word that she used was Daasaxakw. Our house was called Ravine House, Shonach Hit, is what she said in Tlingit. It had sleeping platforms inside. They were built inside it. There were 14 levels of them. They were dug inside there. They stayed there during the winter. They used to have war long ago. At night, they would attack one another. For that reason, they dug inside that house that many sleeping platforms. There were 14 levels of sleeping platforms in there. Women and children they would put on the bottom, whereas the men would stay awake on the top level. They would listen for war parties, that's what they called it when they would attack each other, to avoid being killed, and they lived like that. My husband's mother used to tell me that fall time, high tides would come in there where the fire was. That's how deep it was. So it was called Ravine House or Shonach Hit. So there are also many kutia associated with the houses there. And again, as I said, there are 8 of those at the Totem Heritage Center. I don't have time to go into many of them, but just wanted to highlight a few that you may be familiar with as folks who can go to the Totem Heritage Center. So this is a mortuary pole that was brought from Daasaxakw. You can see on the back side it has the recess for cremated remains that would have been tucked in there in a bentwood box. And notice it's a man with a fish again, right? The sculpin, and he's holding a club. So could this be Lakachine or that story that William Paul was referencing from the earlier Taakwaani pole? I don't know. Oh, I wanted to share too that some of the information around Village Island or Daasaxakw was recorded by T.T. Waterman, the anthropologist that I mentioned at the very beginning. And his papers are now in the National Anthropological Archives. And I'm not going to show any of the map, but he took a lot of important records about the different houses. And again, he was talking about Peter Williams. He was this was one of the main Taant'a Kwáan Ganachadi men he was consulting with. So this is an image of Peter Williams, who gave a lot of the information on Daasaxakw. And I love this photograph for many reasons. One, it was taken by B.A. Haldane, a very famous Tsimshian photographer from Metlakatla. And it was when Peter Williams, as a Taant'a Kwáan Ganachadi man, was living in Metlakatla. So I wanted to point that out too, that even after the Taant'a Kwáan had moved from Annette Island and the Tsimshian had come in, there were still many Taant'a Kwáan Tlingit who lived there and intermarried with the Tsimshian as well. So, and if you look really closely, there's this photograph tucked into his coat pocket. seems to be a woman in a dress. I don't know who this is. I would love to know more. Someone suggested Mrs. Crosby, the wife of the missionary at Port Simpson, because there were Taant'a Kwáan boys who went to the school there in Port Simpson. But again, I don't know. The reason that I wanted to bring all this up, though, is because the pole that's there at the Totem Heritage Center was associated in the records with Gooch Hit, the wolf house. And I can't tell if that very decayed crest up at the very top, was that originally a wolf? That would be so helpful to kind of help identify what clan this pole belonged to. I'm also really studying some of the T.T. Waterman papers because he talks about the different houses and labels them as wolf, killer whale, wolf, bear, raven, and even eagle. And bear is almost certainly Taakwaani, raven, Ganachadi, wolf, killer whale, perhaps Taakwaani. But eagle is really, it stumps me because usually I associate that with the Nisga'a of the Taant'a Kwáan. So again, so many questions here. You're probably wondering, why is she even presenting this? It's partly because I'm hoping there might be some answers in the audience eventually. Another famous pole I'm sure many of you know, but that we know there was an original at Daasaxakw in Village Island, is the Fog Woman pole, and this is one that's still at the Totem Heritage Center, so please forgive my photographs from behind glass. But this is where she originally stood at Daasaxakw, and T.T. Waterman noted the salmon on Fog Daughter, Fog Hat, associated with Kichxáan, or the Golden Eagle House. And of course, you all know this pole because this was a CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps replica that was made of the Village Island version for the Totem Park out at Totem Bight. And then also, of course, right downtown Ketchikan of Kichxáan of the Ganachadi. This was another of those Fog Woman poles. And there are some really interesting comparisons that I don't have time to go into between the Village Island one and the later Ketchikan one that was erected in the early 20th century. But some of these continuing crests from all of the Taant'a Kwáan village sites really get carried over to Ketchikan. And the last one that I'll share is this sea lion house post, a GOTS from Sea Lion House, Tan Hit at Daasaxakw. And what's been really exciting is to learn that there were sea lion posts at Taakwaani Island. They're now at the Berlin Ethnologist Museum. And I got to view them. They're incredible carved posts. You can see I love the little ear of the Taan of the sea lion, and the face that's down in the tail of the sea lion itself. So there's also from Annette Island, these sea lion house posts that are now up at the Alaska State Museum. So again, just trying to track down any of the Taant'a Kwáan art that's still extant. After Daasaxakw, and the last stop that we'll have time for today is to go over to Ketchikan, place on the Cottonwoods or Taakwaani Island. And there are several oral histories as to why the Taant'a Kwáan migrated from Daasaxakw to Ketchikan. You can see Peter Williams told T.T. Waterman that they could not get any grease except seal grease at Village Island, and so better hooligan grease came from the Nass River, so they went to Taakwaani Island. George Keegan Williams stated that our people moved from Village Island near Duke Island. This was way before white people came here. My father told me he was living at Tongass Village on Taakwaani Island when the first American soldiers came here. And Joseph Johns, that we read at the very beginning, just to remind you, he also said, this was before the American soldiers came up there. And I really wanted to emphasize that because I often hear in the history that Tongass Village was established as a military fort, but the Taant'a Kwáan, according to all of these histories, were already there. And there's also evidence from the U.S. military side that Chief Ebbets, the famous Taakwaani clan leader, really kind of courted the U.S. Navy for a trade post. This is Robert Scott's. He was a colonel in the U.S. Army, and he reported that Ebbets, chief of the Tongass, is very anxious to have an American trading post established on the island. So I'm not sure if he wanted the military for it as much as trade. And thinking we must be there for some such purpose, he offered a house and garden patch to Major Hoyt and myself for nothing. He says that the establishment of such a station would concentrate the scattered members of his own tribes and many other Indians, and that many Indians would go there to trade who now deal at Fort Simpson and on the Nass River. And of course, Americans were very interested in having the trade concentrated on the U.S. side of the border and not going over to Port Simpson in Canada. So, again, I'm just trying to establish that the Taant'a Kwáan were already on Tongass Island when the U.S. military fort was established there in 1868. So these are the famous photographs I'm sure you have all seen by Edward Muybridge, as Richard referenced at the very beginning, taken when Muybridge had come up with Major General Henry Halleck to Alaska in 1868 to survey this new vast region that William Seward had purchased from Russia the year before, of course, without any negotiation with indigenous people who claimed that land. These photographs are so famous, and I mean, if you look closely at this one, I was just talking with Richard Joel at the beginning, they seem to all be wearing bear crests, probably the Taakwaani clan, perhaps. I'm not sure if this is Ebbets himself in the Chilkat robe and wearing the bear's ears. There's also this man wearing, classic Western suit, obviously adept in trade. This house in the back has milled sawn boards, right, that were made perhaps from Port Simpson's mill just across the border. And something I had never noticed before, but there's also a Chilkat robe, a Nakane robe that's draped over one of these poles. And note the pole with the sculpin spines again, right? I'm not sure what crest this is, if we've seen that sculpin crests again and again. The sea lion, Taan over here by Sakhit, the starfish house of the Ganachadi. So much that's amazing and documented in these photographs. And as you may know, the photographs that Muybridge originally took were meant to be stereographs. This was a really popular form of entertainment in the 19th century, where you see two slightly offset images. They are taken to be slightly offset so that when you view them through a stereographic machine, or this viewer, it's not a machine, it's a very simple device, but it mimics the kind of depth of how your eyes see. It puts the two images together, and you can see this incredible depth of how Muybridge really composed these photographs. I had never had the opportunity to see these the stereographs. I've always just seen them as flat photographs. And after a year of asking permission and writing various letters to the curator of the Bancroft Library, I had the opportunity to view the original stereographs with this viewfinder. You can see, you just put the stereograph in the end of the viewfinder and it puts the two images together for your eyes. I long to bring this up here because I don't know how many Taant'a Kwáan folks have been able to see these stereographs, and I can't bring the originals here, but a colleague of mine said, well, the best way to give the effect of a stereograph is to make a wigglegram. And so I don't want to give anyone a seizure, but this is putting the two images together. And I just hope you can see for a minute, even though it's kind of blurred, the depth that these stereographs really allow. It really brings the women to the forefront. Notice this image brings the women front. The men no longer have their rifles. It's very interesting, whereas the other one was more foregrounding the men and the warriors with their regalia. So, sorry, I don't want to get anyone dizzy there. Okay, it's 7:00, so of course I'm always running out of time. I just wanted to also note, even before the military fort at Taant'a Island, there's a lot of history of Taant'a Kwáan people living in that area and being really important to the Hudson Bay Company that was established first up on the Nass River and then over in Lac Kwáan, Fort Simpson, and Tsimshian territory. And I've been studying some of the Hudson Bay Company archives in Winnipeg. Fortunately, they did digitized a lot of these old HBC journals, but there are a lot of references to Tongass people going over and being really important provisioners of venison and fish to the early HBC forts way back in the 1830s. So you can see here a reference to Chief Ebbets, who gave Mr. Work, the main factor at the Hudson Bay Company of Fort Simpson, a chart of the coast made by himself from this place as far as Kichxáan. I just love that. He knew that coast so well. He could kind of map it out for the HBC factor. This, again, I'm looking all over museums in Europe and the United States, Canada, for anything I can find that's Taant'a Kwáan. And in Birmingham, Alabama, of all places, they have this button robe, a tunic that came from Ketchikan, apparently. And it's so interesting because it's made out of a Hudson Bay Company. Their blankets. And on the inside, I don't have a picture of it, but it has this marking of 2.5, which means that it costs 2.5 beaver pelts to buy this particular blanket. So it seems to have, I'm not sure if that's a frog crest. This was Ganachadi. So much I still don't know, but trying to track down some of this Taant'a Kwáan history. Another artist I'm really trying to follow is Mary Ebbets Hunt. I'm sure many of you know she was Taant'a Kwáan Ganachadi. Later married a Hudson Bay Company factor down in Fort Rupert in Kwakwaka'wakw territory. And, you know, when I was studying Nachhain or Chilkat weaving, it's always spoken of as coming from the Nisga'a, Tsimshian, up to mainly the Chilkat Valley up in Tlingit. But I really want to remind everyone, we know someone down here in the south, the southern Tlingit, she also clearly had the right to weave and had derived that knowledge somehow. So she has a very distinctive style of weaving. You can see that bear. It's often interpreted as a bear crest in the center with her raven crests on the side panels. This is at the Autry Museum. This is another at the Nelson Atkins Museum. Really interesting use of red. She's also famous for not using cedar bark in her warp, unlike most Nachhain weavers who had cedar bark. So I would love to know more about this kind of southern Nachhain weaving tradition with Mary Ebbets Hunt, because as many of you may know, when she marries down in Kwakwaka'wakw territory, her son, George Hunt, becomes a really important, famous collaborator of the anthropologist Franz Boas. And if you study Northwest Coast history, like he's so famous for this. And Mary Ebbets Hunt was always famous for bringing Nachhain weaving to the Kwakwaka'wakw. So now the Hunt family and a few families that are descended from Mary Ebbets Hunt have that right to Nachhain weaving. So again, this really important Taant'a Kwáan woman to this kind of art history of the Northwest Coast. I'm out of time, so I'm just going to show you a few last photographs, again, emphasizing the kind of interactions of the Taant'a Kwáan with other groups around Dixon Entrance. Many of you know the Proud Raven or Lincoln pole. I've talked about it in the past. But this was carved by a Nisga'a artist, according to George McKay. And he even named the artist. He said that it was carved by a Nass Indian by the name of Haida. for the Star family, the Taant'a Kwáan family at Tongass Island. So I'm really interested in when they brought like Nisga'a artists to Tongass to carve these interactions with other groups. And then just last, a few things that I found that I've never seen published before for the Taant'a Kwáan. This is at the British Museum. And I'm not sure if this is depicting a Tlingit person wearing a naval costume, or if it's a white person wearing, the naval epaulets and everything. It's huge. Just to give you scale, this was back right after the pandemic, but and the base of it, it's beautifully carved. Look at those epaulets. The base of it is just cut off, so I don't even know what it came from originally. Was it a pole? Was it, I don't think it could have been a canoe prow, but anyway, lots of interesting carvings. And this is also at the British Museum, massive raven head finial. Erica Brown actually helped figure out probably which pole it originally came from at Ketchikan, and I apologize I didn't bring in that photo, but just beautiful carving on this raven figure. I love this ridge of his brow and into his eye socket that comes over with the ears. And also at the British Museum, they had these beautiful walrus ivory earrings of, again, this raven crest, said to have come from Tongass. So probably Ganafadi earrings that someone wore. This was labeled as a heron's. I wonder if it's raven, soapberry spoon from Tongass. And I just wanted to close. We don't have time to go into the history of the move from Kadukulka or Tongass Island to Ketchikan. But I think many of you here know that Saxman was named after Samuel Saxman, a white missionary who drowned in December 1886 when he was looking for a new site for a school. And what's famous about that, too, is that one of the canoemen with him was Lewis Paul, who was Taant'a Kwáan Te Kwáan, the father of William Paul, that important Tlingit lawyer that I'd mentioned. And Lewis Paul also died in December 1886. This was a letter that he wrote in June 1886 to Sheldon Jackson, because Lewis Paul was also, he was a trained missionary. And apparently Sheldon Jackson was already looking for a new site for a school. I found this letter at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, and it was really exciting to just see the handwriting of Lewis Paul. But it's also a really important letter because he writes, I received your 2 letters about the building at Naha. This is going to be a new school. The people would be discouraged to hear of the building at Naha. It would be useless for me to try to move them because I know just as plain what they want. Some of the people had already gone to Port Chester, that's over on Annette Island, remember, to lay the foundations, and I don't know how I will tell them of the building at Naha. They will laugh at me. They will think I am fooling them. I wait here for your reply. And on the other page, he writes, we hope and pray that the board would change their mind about the building at Naha. If you have the building at Port Chester, it would be a great deal different. We will have Haidas, Cape Fox, and Tongass together at Port Chester. Please let me hear from you just as soon as you receive this. So he was thinking clearly of, and apparently there were many Taant'a Kwáan in Tongass who wanted to build their school and mission over at Port Chester, their old village site, Taakwaani. Clearly this is June 1886. He drowns in December 1886, and the Tsimshian come in 1887. So it's a very interesting history of what happened at that time. This is one photo of Lewis Paul and his wife Tilly Paul, later Tilly Paul Tamery. Their 2 sons were William and Lewis Paul. Lewis Paul was born just shortly after his father had drowned, and so Tilly named him after Lewis. But I think it's a beautiful photograph of that young couple sometime before 1886. And this is my last slide. This is what Tilly Paul wrote to Sheldon Jackson, because after she was widowed, she had 2 young children. She was living at Tongass, and Sheldon Jackson brought her up to Sitka to work at his industrial training school, and partly to give her a way to provide for herself. And she wrote to Sheldon Jackson in 1897 when he was back east raising funds for his school. She wrote, quote, "I enjoy my work here, but my heart often goes out toward Tongass people." And she wrote again and again in her letters about how much she had loved the Taant'a Kwáan. So thank you for your patience with me. I don't have very many answers for this history. I'm just starting to, trying to educate myself about Taant'a Kwáan history and try to find more of the art that's still out there that we can learn from. Gunalchish, hoho, gunalchish. Be happy to take any questions or have discussion.
William Paul's father was half French. William Paul and his brother were attorneys. And William Paul's mother was Lily Tamery from Wrangell, whose uncle was Charles Jones, who went to vote in 1922 and was arrested. Because in order to vote, you had to become a citizen. And the only way you can become a citizen was go before 5 people, non-natives, and tell them you gave up your culture and your history. And they would vote on it and say you could vote. Well, Tilly got her son, said, your great uncle's going to be arrested, so you need to defend him. And he was working with the Alaska Native Brotherhood at the time, early, him and his brother Lewis. So they came here to Ketchikan, and they had a federal judge and they had a trial. Territorial was pretty small then. And they said he had the right to vote. So in essence, 2 years later, the Native Americans got citizenship and the right to vote. Alaska's ahead of the United States. And the people here in Ketchikan were in the jury and said he had the right to vote. People here in Ketchikan were here when William Paul defended the right of Nettie Ellis Jones to go to school here, because the school had available space, but the school board said he didn't. So they went to court, and she went to school here. And so William Paul was really instrumental in, through his mother and his father, because they were both teachers and educated, of defending Southeastern Alaska's civil rights. And he worked hard with the Alaska Native Brotherhood, which I'm the Grand President Emeritus right now, to gain these rights that they should have had in the first place, because Alaska was not a conquered country. It was negotiated without the involvement of the people that were originally from this land. Hence, they had to deal with the settlement of the land claims years and years later, because the Russians said in the Treaty of Secession they'll leave that to the United States, but they never left it out, that they had to deal with this. So, and then you go later on with the A and B with civil rights or equal rights, anti-discrimination with Elizabeth Pradovich, which this hall is named after, and her husband Roy Pradovich, who I met in 1981 when he had a convention here in Ketchikan. They were instrumental in going to Juneau twice. And there's another plus for Ketchikan there too, because there's a pharmacist here in Ketchikan named Norman R. Walker, Walker Field baseball. he was in the territorial legislature, standing beside Elizabeth Pradovich and Roy Pradovich 2 times, one in 1941 and finally in 1945 when she went before the legislature and they voted to end discrimination through the Anti-Discrimination Act. So I always say that because I'm proud of Ketchikan, because we didn't ignore what was right and fair. And all because of the history there of early people like William Paul and Lewis Paul, and earlier than that, his mother and father, because they were involved and continually involved in fair treatment, and by voicing that opinion, the people agreed in Ketchikan, and the people agreed at the legislature later on. So I just had to say that because they are so important to Alaska, because we were pace setters here. Because I was in the Navy in 1968, and they still weren't settled on that. I went to school down in Watts, East LA with my sister, and saw they burned down Watts. And so we were we didn't really know it here in Alaska, but we were very early on satisfying equality of human beings as treated as such. So I just needed to say that as an end in honor of William Paul, and his father, who died, was Samuel Jackson, looking for a place for education. And my mother went to Sheldon Jackson to be educated, but unfortunately during that time, before vote, they weren't, they're trying to assimilate, culturate us into the mainstream. So my mother was sent to a place in the meditation room in Sheldon Jackson with the mattress and a little room, was punished for speaking to somebody there in our language. And along that way, she ran into a fellow from Kichxáan, Dexter Wallace, he's Haida. And she was there by herself, and he adopted her as her brother. Haida and the Tlingit, who cared about each other, so she would be cared for. This is just to look at this kindness that can happen beyond yourself. And then I always say, when something's going on, and you are there and you see it and you don't say anything, you're complicit in that fault. So you must clear your conscience and say something to address it if it is apparent that it shouldn't happen. But thank you again, Emily, for this presentation on behalf of our Taakwaani. And get over here, Joel. This is called a response.
Kichxáan, Richard, for once again, he's leading the way and always mentoring those around him, including myself. And for that, I'm always deeply grateful. Thank you for the presentation tonight, Kichxáan. We appreciate the effort, and I've learned a couple things tonight about watching that. There's much still to be learned. One of the things I wanted to know, I forgot to bring it, but I do have a letter handwritten from William Paul to Uncle Frank Williams. And I was going to gift that to you tonight, but I'll have to do it another time for your records that you keep learning for us and others. And so I'm grateful for that. And thank you all for hearing and learning about us, the living history that is the Sea Lion people, the Brown Bear side, the Raven side, the Delthwitty. We heard about the Delthwitty are no longer here. That's because they moved north. They're actually in the Tutling, Yukon territory, Delthwitty. They moved north. Yeah, Ducklwitty moved north. So that's part of the history, is they moved north. From what I was told, probably in the late 1700s or so, they moved away. And so they ended up in the northern country. So, but anyway, there's grateful, Kichxáan, for you guys hearing our story and learning a little about us and us learning about them, because it is us. We're all part of the history.
I have one more. I need to represent it for the hearing protectors. This is Kai. I don't remember his last name. He's a great grandchild of Taakwaani, and he speaks on behalf of us at the fishing game over the herring. And his father is Mohawk, and he's from Yakutat. I just thought, because we're looking to the future, that he says a few words of because he being my great grandson, we look at that as very important. When he acknowledged me, and I thought that respect allowed me to respect him and say a few words.
My great-grandfather was Yanyanish Olaf Abraham of the Yakutat Taakwaani from on Tlingit. And one of the things that I learned about him was that he used to say, Hasta Kwesa Yakudash Gunshish Wuduhani. There's nothing heavier than to say Gunshish, thank you. And heavier means more important or more valuable. And it's one of the most beautiful things about Hakusti, our culture, that I ever learned. That to say thank you is the most powerful thing in our language. And I want to say, Taant'a Kwáan, Kwáan. Thank you to my relatives down here in Ketchikan for your love and kindness to me as your great-grandson.
Thank you again for coming.